There's yeast in our dough, and we need to know what it's doing in there. It turns out, yeast is a living creature that multiplies inside our dough? That's not what yeast looks like. No. Yeast is a tiny, single-celled organism that we want to grow in our dough. But why? It turns out yeast helps create the distinctive aromas and tastes that people often associate with fresh-baked bread products. What's more, yeast makes breads airy and chewy, not brittle and crumbly like a cracker. So how does yeast do it? When given a warm and moist environment, along with sugar for food, sleeping yeast wakes up, grows and multiplies very quickly. The yeast converts the sugar it eats into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas and releases it into its environment. Let's see what happens when we wake up yeast with some warmth, water, and sugar. After a few minutes, look what's happened. All that yeast eating, growing, multiplying, and releasing alcohol and carbon dioxide has turned our water frothy with air bubbles. If we don't see this reaction in warm sugar water, it means the yeast is dead. But wait, a lot of our dough doesn't have sugar in it. So what's the yeast eating in there? It turns out that yeast is equipped with a very special enzyme which converts starches into sugars. So when we mix yeast with flour and moisture and warmth, the yeast converts the starches in the flour to sugar, which it then eats. Okay, but why would we want that in our dough? Turns out the yeast can't convert and eat all of the flour, and wheat flour turns very sticky when it gets wet. So, when the yeast releases alcohol and carbon dioxide, it gets trapped in the sticky flour. As more and more gets trapped, the dough rises as it gets more flavorful and airy. During the baking process, the alcohol evaporates, but leaves behind that distinctive bready flavor. And what about the carbon dioxide? Well, that leaves air pockets in the baked product. And what about the yeast? There's no need to worry about eating it because it dies during the baking process. So that's yeast, and that's what it's doing in our dough.